Hi Year 11. This really short video is going to help you with slide 63 onwards. Just going to go through a couple of the slides and most importantly how you construct your paragraphs at the end of watching this series. This first slide is about the modern elements. So what has changed between the original text and the modern interpretation? I mentioned this really briefly before we started watching the episodes, but now you can see that there are things that are very much part of our world and would not necessarily have existed 200 years ago. So for example, cosmetic surgery, this fascination with celebrity deaths, blogging. I've put there one of the websites, one of the fan websites for Sherlock that you can go and have a look at. You're going to create, as part of your T.E.E.L practice, 2 paragraphs. So you can pick any 2 of those 4 dot points or an additional different one if you've got something that you want to focus on. And you're going to answer the question, how do these elements adapt traditional generic features in new ways? So adapt means change. So what the question is asking is, how does that feature or that dot point you have picked change what is traditional into something new? One of the key features that's different, which I've mentioned a couple of times, is that in the original series, John writes newspaper columns, but in the modern series, he writes blog posts. And actually in the modern series, in later seasons, these blog posts become really popular and it's their main way of getting cases rather than through the police. People come to them through the blog. You're going to have a look again at John's blog if you get time, and then answers these questions, but not in full sentences. We just want some dot points. So you're going to basically use these as subheadings to consider how online communities have changed the way that we engage with text. Would you, for example, watch something new without reading a review first, without asking someone first, without watching that little summary at the top of Netflix or Stan or whatever streaming platform? Would you watch something that wasn't recommended for you? So on those streaming platforms, it comes up with a match. This is a 65% match for you. How much stock or how much weight do you put into those things that are created for you? Do you engage in a different way than you would have perhaps 10, 20 years ago, where you turned on the TV and you had a choice of very few options? The last thing I want you to do, just down the bottom of this slide, is to download the app and see if you can solve the crimes that they've got. That one there, I would recommend it, but it is optional and you don't have to include that in your dot points if you don't want to. To summarize the series, we're going to write 3 T.E.E.L paragraphs. The first one, I've got an example for you on the next slide, and then the second one, I put some inclusions of things that you could talk about. I'll get to those in a minute. For each of these, you need to have a completed T.E.E.L paragraph in your book. That's at least 4 sentences, although please do remember that your 4 sentences is the minimum, not the maximum. The 3 questions here are, how are perceptions of and relationships with others and the world shaped in and through film language? You can already see that these questions on here are quite wordy. You need to work out what they mean before you start. So I know, for example, that film language means techniques. So I'm going to think, okay, how is my understanding of the world and others' understanding of the world shaped through film techniques? Then I look at my text. We're going to show an example of this on the next slide. The first thing to remember is that you've watched at this point about 4.5 hours of Sherlock television. That is way too much to try and get into one T.E.E.L paragraph or one essay or one podcast, as you will get to later. So I want you to focus on something specific. Anything that you can link to the question, for example, from your viewing notes, is going to become something that you focus on. If you can't describe or explain that thing in one sentence, it's probably too big a chunk to try and talk about in a short response. I've got some sentence starters here for you. So I've color-coded your topic sentence, your example, your explanation, and your link, but I've left some things out. You can copy and complete these if you need the extra assistance, although you can complete it independently if possible. So I started with, people's perceptions of others in the world they live in can be changed through film language. So I've reworded the question, I've taken out some of those things that perhaps I didn't really understand, and I've answered it. I've said it can be changed. For example, the modern Sherlock by the BBC is based in London and may make people who live in London think something about their city. I've chosen to focus on London only because it is referenced in a number of ways throughout. So, for example, at the opening of each episode, if you didn't skip it, there are different London landscapes. There are important London landmarks referenced throughout, museums and the like, and the culture of London, so for example, the black cabs, is referenced throughout as well. I've then said, well, I need to talk about film techniques, so the film techniques such as emphasize how London looks to outsiders, and therefore it might change the way that Londoners actually view themselves because they're seeing it represented differently. This is just one really brief example of something you could talk about, and I definitely don't want you to feel limited or like you have to have a similar line of inquiry here. This is question number 2. It is, what is the value of the composer and responder in controlling and choosing the reading pathways through texts? This is a difficult question. It's quite similar to the language that they use in the HSC because it refers to composers and responders. The composer is the creator, so the artist, the poet, the author, the director. And the responder is the viewer or reader, so that's you. It's really important that you understand that the way you read text is up to you. In this case, like I mentioned previously in the third video, you can choose whether to skip forward or skip back. You can choose whether to watch them in order or out of order. This is more the case with something like a video game where you can actually die, respawn, try again, try different things, or do the same challenges over and over and repeat it in a slightly different way to improve. You're controlling the way that you read that text. Even if you don't think something like a video game is a text, it actually is. You respond to it in an individual way, and that's what gives it value. This here is the same. So the question is asking, who is more important, the writer or the responder? Who is choosing the way that the text is read, the writer or the responder? Who is controlling how we respond, the writer or the responder? Once you've reworded that question and maybe looked up some new words or some definitions of things you don't understand, you're going to think about, well, okay, here's my response. I perhaps think that in this case, the composer is more significant because as the director, there is no other option for the end of this episode other than what they've already decided. I then think, but I didn't have to start from episode 1, season 1. I didn't have to respond in the way that I did. I actually only responded in the way that I did because I read something on a blog or a fan fiction that suggested this, and that made me think differently about it. These are some things that you could talk about, but it's not a definitive list. If you've got your own ideas, please go with them and then seek feedback once you've written the paragraph. So I've said you could talk about things like, well, Sherlock is still a television series. It originally aired 1 episode at a time, so that's the control there being in the composer's hands. Now, however, you can watch the episodes out of order, you can skip around, and that puts a bit more control with the responder. Sherlock viewers or responders probably already knew something about the original texts, but then how the composer interprets that gives them control. However, because we've read other texts before or we've seen other Sherlock movies, we have some control of our own expectations. John's blog and fan theories on chat rooms are really popular for this show, so that may have informed the way that some people viewed the text but not others. You can try and see if you would like Sherlock by doing the challenge art that I had on the previous slide, but you don't have to. So you could talk about any one of these things or your own ideas in responding to this question. Once you've done that, you're going to try question number 3 independently, and then I'm going to give you feedback on all 3 questions. Please remember that these are difficult questions and that there is absolutely no shame in asking for help if you need more clarification. Just email or call the school. Thanks, Year 11.